Hannah Mercer knew the exact pattern of the moon's reflection on the polished marble floors of the Volkov Tower. Every night, the same cold gleam met her gaze as she pushed her squeaking cart through the silent, opulent hallways. She was a ghost in the gleaming monument of glass and steel, a night-shift cleaning lady whose presence was meant to be entirely unnoticed. At 25, she felt infinitely older, burdened by a quiet desperation that clung to her like the oversized utilitarian uniform she wore. It hung on her, a drab shroud that erased her slender frame, making her feel even smaller, more insignificant. A mere extension of the mop and bucket. Each careful swipe of her mop, each meticulous dusting of a desk, was a desperate prayer. The medical bills for her mother's rare illness piled higher than the stacks of reports in the executive offices. Losing their tiny apartment in a city as unforgiving as Chicago was a constant, icy dread. Hannah worked tirelessly, her movements practiced, silent, a ballet of necessity performed under the watchful, unblinking eyes of security cameras that never truly saw her. Only the cleaning crew, her only escape, her secret world, was tucked away in her worn backpack, a sketchbook filled with vibrant, fantastical characters. Inside its pages she was a graphic novelist, sketching heroes with defiant eyes and villains with sharp, cunning smiles. It was a stark contrast to her reality, a splash of color in a life muted by worry. But even those dreams felt fragile, constantly threatened by the overwhelming weight of her responsibilities. One particularly late night, the silence of the executive floor was deeper than usual, the air thick with the scent of expensive wood polish and something else, a lingering tension. Hannah was methodically wiping down the expansive desk in one of the corner offices, a space usually reserved for the highest-ranking executives, when she heard it. Voices, hushed but sharp, cut through the quiet hum of the building's ventilation system. They came from the adjoining meeting room, the door slightly ajar. Her breath hitched. She wasn't supposed to hear anything. She was supposed to be invisible. Company data, unsecured server, the deal with organized crime. The words, clipped and urgent, were like ice water poured down her spine. Hannah froze, her hand still clutching the damp cloth. Her heart began to pound, a frantic drum against her ribs, echoing in her ears. She knew enough to know it was bad, dangerously bad, but not enough to grasp the full, terrifying scope of it. Her mind reeled, trying to make sense of the fragments, corporate espionage, something far worse. A cold knot tightened in her stomach. She felt a primal instinct to shrink, to disappear, to become truly invisible. The voices grew louder for a moment, an angry murmur, then lowered again, a chilling conspiratorial whisper. She couldn't make out specifics anymore, but the tone was enough. It spoke of secrets, of betrayal, of consequences that felt lethal. Terror, raw and immediate, seized her. She wasn't a part of this world of power and illicit deals. She was the girl who cleaned up after it. To be caught, even simply to be seen having overheard, felt like a death sentence. Her hands trembled. Slowly, carefully, she backed away from the desk, her movements as quiet as a falling snowflake. Her eyes darted towards the open meeting room door, then to the exit. She didn't dare breathe, didn't dare make a sound. She was a hunted animal, desperate to escape unseen. With agonizing slowness, she slipped out of the office, her cracked mop bucket suddenly feeling like an impossibly loud burden, and vanished into the shadowed hallway, her heart threatening to claw its way out of her chest. The following morning, the Volkov Tower lobby buzzed with the controlled chaos of the city's elite. Sunlight, sharp and cold, sliced through the towering windows, illuminating the polished marble and the hurried footsteps of impeccably dressed professionals. Hannah, clutching her cracked mop bucket, felt even more out of place than usual. The lingering dread from the previous night's overheard conversation had made sleep impossible, leaving her exhausted and jumpy. She was still reeling, trying to convince herself it had been a nightmare, but the icy knot in her stomach told her otherwise. Suddenly a hush fell over the lobby, a collective intake of breath. Hannah knew without looking who it was: Zane Volkov. He moved like a force of nature, not walking so much as commanding the space around him. His tailored suit was a second skin, accentuating the breadth of his shoulders, the lean power of his frame. At 38, he was a titan, formidable and utterly in control, his presence radiating an authority that silenced even the most confident executive. He was already aware of the whispers of corporate espionage within his walls, but Hannah, the invisible girl, was not yet on his radar as a key player. To her, he was simply the distant, terrifying pinnacle of power, a man whose gaze she had always instinctively avoided. Today, however, his gaze found her. It was cold, dismissive, stripping her bare of any pretense of worth. He stopped a few feet away, and the air around them seemed to crackle with tension. His voice, deep and resonant, cut through the hushed lobby like a blade, amplified by the sudden silence. "You!" The single word was a dismissal, a condemnation. "Mercer, isn't it?" Hannah flinched, her heart leaping into her throat. She could only nod, mute with sudden, overwhelming terror. He knew her name. "Your performance, Ms. Mercer, has been unsatisfactory," he stated, his tone devoid of emotion. "Frankly, it's an embarrassment to the standards we uphold at Volkov Tower. Effective immediately, your services are no longer required." The words struck her like physical blows. Publicly, here, in front of everyone. Her face burned with a humiliating flush. Her hands trembled so violently that her cracked mop bucket clattered against the marble, sending a cheap grating sound echoing through the pristine space. It felt like her entire world had tilted, shattering into a million pieces around her feet. The shame was a suffocating blanket, pressing down on her, crushing her spirit. She felt utterly worthless, insignificant, a failure even at the one thing she did to survive. She couldn't meet his gaze, couldn't bear the cold indifference in his eyes. He didn't care. She was nothing to him. "Gather your belongings and ensure you are off the premises within the hour," he finished, turning on his heel before she could even process the words. He didn't wait for a response, didn't spare her another glance. Hannah stood frozen for a moment, the sound of his receding footsteps a death knell. Tears pricked at her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. Not here. Not now. Gathering what little dignity she had left, she bent to retrieve her mop bucket, its cracked plastic a mocking symbol of her broken spirit. She pushed through the heavy revolving doors, out into the biting Chicago wind, feeling utterly cast adrift, homeless and hopeless. Her medical bills, her mother's apartment, all of it suddenly felt like an insurmountable mountain. Zane watched her go, a flicker of something unreadable in his usually impassive eyes. He saw the slumped shoulders, the quick, desperate steps, the way she clutched her worn backpack. The public humiliation had been brutal, a necessary evil, a desperate display to make her seem irrelevant, a disposable employee, ensuring the watchful conspirators, who he now knew were actively hunting for potential witnesses, would dismiss her as a threat. Hannah didn't make it a block. Before she could vanish into the impersonal urban crowd, a dark, imposing figure stepped into her path. It was Zane's head of security, a man whose presence was almost as intimidating as the CEO's. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. "Ms. Mercer, Mr. Volkov requires your immediate presence in his private office." Her heart hammered against her ribs. More humiliation? A final insult? She was led back into the gleaming tower, past the security checkpoints, and into an elevator that seemed to rocket her towards the heavens. She was ushered into an office of breathtaking scale, all glass and steel, overlooking the vast, snow-dusted expanse of Chicago. Zane Volkov stood by the window, a dark, formidable silhouette against the pale winter light. He didn't turn immediately, letting the silence stretch, letting his power settle over her like a physical weight. She felt impossibly small, vulnerable. Finally, he turned. His gaze was intense, unwavering. "You overheard them last night, didn't you, Miss Mercer?" he stated, not asked. The cold certainty in his voice sent a fresh wave of terror through her. He knew her secret was out. "The company data, the organized crime, they're targeting anyone who might have heard," he continued, his voice low, a dangerous rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very floor. "They're ruthless, and now they know you were there." He paused, letting the deadly implications sink in. "I need to protect you. And the only way I can do that, the only way I can keep you alive, is to claim you. You will become my wife, a marriage of convenience, Miss Mercer. You will live under my roof, under my constant protection. You will comply absolutely. This is not a request." Hannah stared at him, bewildered. His words were a torrent, a cold, absolute command that stripped her of any choice. Marriage with him. She was terrified, overwhelmed by the sudden, brutal shift in her reality. But then, as he watched her, a desperate glimmer of hope, sharp and undeniable, pierced through her terror. If he could protect her, perhaps he could protect her mother too. Her mother, her apartment, her desperate fight to survive. Suddenly, a solution, however terrifying, presented itself. It was a golden cage, perhaps, but it offered a chance at life. The private elevator ascended with a silent, breathtaking speed, carrying Hannah further and further away from everything she had ever known. She felt suspended, not just between floors, but between realities. One moment, she was a discarded cleaning lady facing destitution. The next, she was being propelled into the gilded heart of the man who had publicly crushed her, now claiming her as his wife. The air in the elevator was thick with Zane's unspoken authority, a weight that pressed down on her, leaving her breathless. The doors parted with a soft chime, revealing a penthouse that dwarfed her wildest imaginings. It was an expanse of cool marble, polished chrome, and floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a dizzying panorama of the snow-dusted city. Every piece of furniture looked like a work of art. Every surface gleamed. It was breathtakingly beautiful, yet utterly sterile and imposing. Her tiny, cluttered apartment, with its worn-out couch and framed photos, felt 1,000,000 miles away, a life she'd left behind forever. She felt like a stray bird, accidentally fallen into a magnificent, impossibly large cage. Disoriented and overwhelmed, she stood rooted to the spot, clutching her worn backpack like a lifeline. Zane moved past her into the vast living space, his presence filling it effortlessly. He turned, his gaze sweeping over her, a silent command in his dark eyes. "This is your new home, Hannah." His voice was deep, resonant, echoing slightly in the immense space. "You are my wife. As such, you will live here. You will not leave this penthouse without an escort. Your schedule, your movements, they are now my concern. Your past life is gone. You will comply absolutely for your own safety. Do you understand?" His words were not a question. They were a declaration, absolute and unyielding. Hannah felt the full force of his dominance, a wave of power that left her reeling. Her mind tried to rebel, to argue, to question this sudden, brutal erasure of her independence, but the words caught in her throat. The sheer size of him, the unwavering intensity of his gaze, the unshakable certainty in his tone, it all conspired to silence her. She was terrified, a mouse caught in the shadow of a lion. Yet a part of her, a smaller, more desperate part, also registered a flicker of something else. The promise of protection. He wasn't asking, he was demanding her safety. "But my job," she finally managed, her voice a reedy whisper. "My apartment, my mother, I can't just—" Zane cut her off, his expression hardening. "Your job is irrelevant. Your apartment is secured, and your mother—" He paused, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Her medical bills have been settled, in full. Effective this morning. She's now under the care of the best specialists, and her financial needs are no longer your burden." Hannah gasped, the air knocked out of her lungs. Her mother's medical bills, the crushing weight that had defined her entire adult life, gone, just like that. He had already done it. While she was still reeling from the public humiliation, while she was still processing the forced marriage, he had quietly, efficiently taken away her most agonizing worry. The shock was profound, shattering her initial resistance. All the practical, crushing burdens that had made her life a constant struggle. Suddenly lifted by his formidable hand, a tremor ran through her. It was an act of breathtaking power, a cold, calculated move, but it was also a lifeline. He wasn't just demanding her submission, he was offering a profound, undeniable security. The terror of his absolute control was still there, a cold knot in her stomach. But now, mixed with it, was an overwhelming, dizzying sense of relief. He commanded, and the world bent. And now, for the first time in her life, some small part of that bending world was working in her favor. She looked at him, truly looked, and saw not just the dangerous man who had fired her, but the unyielding force who had just rescued her from an impossible burden. He was a golden cage, yes, but it was a cage that promised to keep her mother safe, and her alive. Hannah found herself adrift in a world of stark luxury and stifling control. The penthouse, once a dizzying symbol of Zane's formidable power, quickly became her gilded cage. Every morning she woke to the same panoramic view of Chicago, a city she could see but not touch. The constant presence of security, though mostly unseen, was a palpable weight. She wasn't allowed to leave the apartment unsupervised, not even to wander the executive floors below. Her new life was a carefully orchestrated sequence of events, each step monitored, each moment accounted for. The sprawling tower, once just her workplace, now felt like an impenetrable fortress, designed to keep dangers out, but also, irrevocably, to keep her in. She missed the simple act of choosing her own coffee shop, the quiet anonymity of a public park bench, even the weary commute on the bus. Her independence, once a quiet source of pride, had been stripped away, replaced by a suffocating sense of helplessness. She was Mrs. Volkov, but she felt more like a prized possession, an object to be guarded. A part of her bristled, a quiet defiance, yearning for the mundane freedom she'd lost. She would often stand by the floor-to-ceiling windows, pressing her hand against the cold glass, feeling the immense distance between herself and the bustling life below. Zane, for his part, seemed to exist in a whirlwind of calls, meetings, and unreadable pronouncements. He was a constant, formidable presence, often in the adjoining study, his voice a low, commanding rumble on conference calls. Yet she felt his awareness of her, a silent, pervasive watchfulness. She would catch him sometimes, his dark eyes sweeping over her from across the vast living room, a fleeting, intense glance that made her skin prickle. He rarely spoke to her outside of issuing an instruction or asking a direct question, but she knew he was observing. He watched her quiet routines, how she would instinctively tidy the immaculate surfaces, a habit from her old life she couldn't shake. He saw her curled on one of the plush sofas, a forgotten graphic novel open in her lap, her gaze lost in the intricate details of her sketchbook. She often drew, retreating into her art, a silent rebellion against her confinement. She sketched the skyline, the severe angles of the penthouse, and sometimes, without realizing it, the powerful, sharp lines of a man with an unyielding gaze. He seemed to notice the softness in her, a vulnerability that was a stark contrast to the hard edges of his own world. It was a silent, unsettling scrutiny, as if he were cataloguing every facet of her being. His commands, though often impersonal, were absolute. "Hannah, you will eat a proper meal. The chef will prepare what you require." Or, "These clothes are unsuitable. My assistant will arrange for new attire." Initially, each directive felt like another layer of control, another chain binding her. She resented the loss of agency, the feeling that even her basic needs were now dictated. She didn't want new clothes chosen by a faceless assistant. She wanted her worn jeans and faded sweaters. Yet, slowly, subtly, her perception began to shift. When a new wardrobe arrived, filled with soft silks and tailored fabrics that fit her slender frame perfectly, she couldn't deny the unexpected comfort, the simple dignity they offered compared to her old, ill-fitting uniform. The personal chef, a quiet woman who created exquisite, nourishing meals, ensured she ate regularly, something she'd often neglected in her previous life of exhaustion and worry. And the daily updates on her mother's health delivered by Zane's medical team were thorough and reassuring. Her mother was thriving, her care exemplary, a direct result of Zane's formidable resources. His demands were not just about control, they were about protection, about ensuring her well-being with an efficiency she had never known. The world outside these walls was dangerous, a truth reinforced by every hushed conversation Zane had with his security detail, every clipped phone call. Here, within the penthouse, under his absolute authority, she was safe. The fortress might be her prison, but it was also her shield. When she felt the tremor of fear, a phantom echo of the overheard conversation, she found herself seeking his presence, however distant. His power, once terrifying, now held a strange, undeniable comfort. To obey his commands, however stringent, was to be safe. To be under his dominion was to be protected from the terrifying chaos that still lurked beyond the unseen walls of his world. The invitation to the corporate gala arrived not as a polite query, but as a directive from Zane's assistant. "Mr. Volkov requires your attendance." Hannah's stomach clenched. A high-profile event filled with the very people who existed in Zane's rarefied, dangerous world felt like an impossible ordeal. She was a ghost, a shadow, not someone meant to shine under the harsh glare of public scrutiny. The thought of all those eyes, all those whispers, made her breath catch. She was terrified of making a mistake, of revealing her true self, the cleaning lady beneath the carefully chosen clothes. That evening, as she sat nervously in her dressing room, a soft knock preceded Zane's entrance. He didn't ask if she was ready, he simply observed her. She wore a gown chosen by his assistant, midnight blue silk, simple yet elegant, clinging to her slender frame in a way that felt both foreign and exposed. He held a small velvet box in his hand. "Your hair should be swept back," he commanded, his voice deep, unhurried. He stepped closer, his imposing height making her feel even smaller as she sat. His fingers, surprisingly gentle but firm, lifted a strand of her hair, assessing. She felt the subtle current of his presence, the warmth radiating from him as he moved behind her. He didn't wait for her to comply. Instead, he took the brush from her hand, his large fingers easily enveloping hers, and began to gather her hair. His touch was precise, efficient, yet it sent a shiver down her spine. She could feel the subtle shift of air as he moved, the faint scent of his expensive cologne. Her breath hitched, held captive by his unexpected proximity, by the sheer, overwhelming power of his focus on her. Once her hair was secured, he stepped back, holding out the velvet box. Inside lay a necklace of delicate diamonds, shimmering like captured starlight. "This will suffice," he stated. Without waiting for her response, he reached for it, his hands moving to the nape of her neck. His fingers brushed against her skin as he fastened the clasp, a fleeting contact that made her muscles tense. She could feel the steady beat of his heart through the slight vibration in the air, the sheer, undeniable force of his physical presence dominating the small space. She was acutely aware of the size difference, the way he towered over her, his strength an almost tangible thing. When he was this close, his control was absolute, and she found herself utterly still, a silent, obedient statue. The gala hall was a dazzling, overwhelming spectacle, a sea of faces, glittering lights, and the hum of 100 hushed conversations assaulted Hannah's senses. She felt like an imposter, every step a precarious act. Zane's hand settled firmly at the small of her back, a possessive weight that both grounded and terrified her. He moved through the crowd with an effortless grace, a king among his subjects, and she, a reluctant queen, was swept along in his wake. Whispers followed them, curious glances, assessing stares. Hannah felt herself flush, her anxiety building, but Zane merely tightened his grip, a silent reassurance that was also a clear statement of ownership. He didn't acknowledge the whispers, didn't spare a glance for the curious. His focus remained singular, pulling her deeper into the opulent room. Then he stopped. A small group of powerful-looking men and women turned to greet him, their faces a mask of deference. "Gentlemen, ladies," Zane's voice was smooth, commanding, carrying a weight that silenced even the faint background music. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Hannah Volkov." His hand, which had been at her back, now moved to her waist, his thumb resting just above her hip. It was a subtle, yet undeniably possessive gesture, a clear declaration of his claim. Hannah's breath caught. The words, "my wife," felt both foreign and incredibly powerful, echoing in the air around them. She could feel the gazes of the others, sharp and assessing, but Zane's presence beside her, his hand warm and firm, was an unyielding shield. She saw the conspirators from the previous night among the crowd, their eyes darting towards her, then quickly away, dismissed by Zane's unwavering gaze. His possessive stance, his casual confidence, sent a clear, undeniable message to everyone in the room. She was his. A strange wave washed over her. It was a mix of vulnerability and something else, a profound, unexpected sense of safety. The whispers around them died down, replaced by polite, if surprised, greetings. She didn't have to speak, didn't have to impress, didn't have to defend herself. Zane did all of it simply by existing, by claiming her as his own. His dominance, which had once felt so terrifyingly restrictive, now felt like an impenetrable fortress. As the evening progressed, Hannah found herself yielding more fully to his guidance. When he subtly steered her away from a particular group, she followed without question. When he leaned down to murmur an instruction about who to acknowledge, she complied, trusting his judgment implicitly. She had always carried the burden of her own survival, the constant anxiety of making the right choice, of protecting herself and her mother. Now that burden was gone. Zane's absolute authority, his unyielding control, was no longer just a cage, it was a refuge. She looked at his profile, sharp and formidable, as he engaged in conversation, his gaze sweeping the room with an almost predatory awareness. He was protecting her, not just from the tangible threats of the conspirators, but from the overwhelming chaos of this new, intimidating world. She felt a deep, unfamiliar comfort in his shadow, a strange peace in the knowledge that she didn't have to fight, didn't have to fear. She simply had to trust him, to obey him, and in his formidable power, she would be safe. The unsettling hum of the penthouse, usually a quiet backdrop to Hannah's days, seemed to deepen with an unspoken tension. The gilded cage, which had begun to feel like a haven, now felt acutely vulnerable. She was sketching by the vast windows, finding solace in the intricate lines of her graphic novel characters, when a sudden, urgent buzz from Zane's study shattered the fragile peace. His voice, usually a low rumble, became sharper, clipped, laced with an edge of cold fury she hadn't heard before. Hannah instinctively stilled, her pencil hovering over the page. She could feel the shift in the air, a tightening that made her breath catch. Zane emerged from his study moments later, his face a mask of granite. His eyes, usually dark and intense, seemed to hold a dangerous, glacial fire. He didn't look at her directly, but the sheer force of his presence commanded the room, making her feel small and exposed. "They found something," he stated, his voice low, almost a growl directed at a point beyond her towards the unseen security. "At your old apartment. A calling card." Hannah's blood ran cold. Her old apartment. The one he had secured, the one she thought was safe, locked away from her new reality. The conspirators. They had found it. They had found her. The terror she had suppressed since that night in the office burst forth, raw and immediate. Her hands began to tremble so violently she had to grip her sketchbook to stop it from falling. The thought of them, those shadowy figures invading her last sanctuary, felt like a violation. Zane turned then, his gaze finally sweeping over her. It was a look that acknowledged her fear, but also demanded her complete composure. "A single pressed orchid petal," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion, "left on your bedside table, from the plant your mother kept, a reminder that they know where you've been and where you're going." The detail was chilling, deeply personal. It spoke of surveillance, of a patient, deadly hunt. Hannah felt a wave of nausea. They knew her mother's plant. They had been inside her home. The walls of the penthouse, once so comforting in their solidity, suddenly felt like thin glass. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Zane's reaction was immediate, chillingly decisive. He moved, not with haste, but with a terrifying, controlled power. He barked orders into his comms, his voice cutting through the space like a whip. Security protocols were instantly escalated. The penthouse, already a fortress, transformed into something impregnable. New security personnel, grim-faced and heavily armed, appeared as if from the very walls, their presence a stark, visual reminder of the lethal stakes. Additional layers of biometric scanners were activated, new surveillance grids deployed. Hannah watched him, mesmerized by his ruthless efficiency, by the sheer, unyielding force of his will. He was a general on a battlefield, commanding his forces with lethal precision, every decision absolute, every word a non-negotiable decree. "No one enters or exits this floor without my direct authorization," he commanded, his voice echoing with an authority that brooked no argument. "Sweep every inch, every system, every shadow." Hannah stood frozen, a silent witness to the storm Zane was unleashing. His movements were fluid, powerful, his large frame radiating an intensity that was almost overwhelming. She felt the depth of his anger, a potent, dangerous force directed entirely at the unseen enemy. It was terrifying, yet within that terror, a strange sense of calm began to settle over her. He was not afraid. He was resolute. He strode over to his desk, pulling out a thick legal document. Hannah recognized the heavy binding, the formal script of a non-disclosure agreement. He had made her sign one, a formality she'd barely understood in her haze of fear. Now he looked at it, a flicker of cold contempt in his eyes. And then, with a sharp, tearing sound, he shredded it. The act was deliberate, almost violent, the paper tearing into long, jagged strips. "They've broken every pact, every agreement," he stated, his voice flat, emotionless. "They are no longer bound by anything, and neither am I." The symbolic act was a revelation. It confirmed the deadly reality of her situation. This wasn't just corporate espionage, it was an all-out war. And Zane, in his tailored suit, was prepared to fight it with every weapon at his disposal. He was revealing his true nature, a force of nature as unyielding as the concrete and steel of his tower, and she, by his side, was now inextricably bound to that power. She looked at the shredded paper, then at him, his profile stark and formidable against the city lights. Her fear was still a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a growing, profound understanding. His ruthlessness was not just a characteristic, it was her shield. In this dangerous new world, his dominance was the only thing standing between her and utter annihilation. To obey him, to trust him implicitly, was not just a choice, it was survival. And in that terrifying, absolute certainty, Hannah found a strange, undeniable refuge. The unsettling hum of the penthouse, usually a quiet backdrop to Hannah's days, seemed to deepen with an unspoken tension. The gilded cage, which had begun to feel like a haven, now felt acutely vulnerable. She was sketching by the vast windows, finding solace in the intricate lines of her graphic novel characters, when a sudden, urgent buzz from Zane's study shattered the fragile peace. His voice, usually a low rumble, became sharper, clipped, laced with an edge of cold fury she hadn't heard before. Hannah instinctively stilled, her pencil hovering over the page. She could feel the shift in the air, a tightening that made her breath catch. Zane emerged from his study moments later, his face a mask of granite. His eyes, usually dark and intense, seemed to hold a dangerous, glacial fire. He didn't look at her directly, but the sheer force of his presence commanded the room, making her feel small and exposed. "They found something," he stated, his voice low, almost a growl, directed at a point beyond her, towards the unseen security. "At your old apartment, a calling card." Hannah's blood ran cold. Her old apartment, the one he had secured, the one she thought was safe, locked away from her new reality. The conspirators, they had found it, they had found her. The terror she had suppressed since that night in the office burst forth, raw and immediate. Her hands began to tremble so violently she had to grip her sketchbook to stop it from falling. The thought of them, those shadowy figures invading her last sanctuary, felt like a violation. Zane turned then, his gaze finally sweeping over her. It was a look that acknowledged her fear, but also demanded her complete composure. "A single pressed orchid petal," he continued, his voice devoid of emotion, "left on your bedside table, from the plant your mother kept, a reminder that they know where you've been and where you're going." The detail was chilling, deeply personal. It spoke of surveillance, of a patient, deadly hunt. Hannah felt a wave of nausea. They knew her mother's plant. They had been inside her home. The walls of the penthouse, once so comforting in their solidity, suddenly felt like thin glass. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic, trapped bird. Zane's reaction was immediate, chillingly decisive. He moved not with haste, but with a terrifying, controlled power. He barked orders into his comms, his voice cutting through the space like a whip. Security protocols were instantly escalated. The penthouse, already a fortress, transformed into something impregnable. New security personnel, grim-faced and heavily armed, appeared as if from the very walls, their presence a stark, visual reminder of the lethal stakes. Additional layers of biometric scanners were activated, new surveillance grids deployed. Hannah watched him, mesmerized by his ruthless efficiency, by the sheer, unyielding force of his will. He was a general on a battlefield, commanding his forces with lethal precision, every decision absolute, every word a non-negotiable decree. "No one enters or exits this floor without my direct authorization," he commanded, his voice echoing with an authority that brooked no argument. "Sweep every inch, every system, every shadow." Hannah stood frozen, a silent witness to the storm Zane was unleashing. His movements were fluid, powerful, his large frame radiating an intensity that was almost overwhelming. She felt the depth of his anger, a potent, dangerous force directed entirely at the unseen enemy. It was terrifying, yet within that terror, a strange sense of calm began to settle over her. He was not afraid. He was resolute. He strode over to his desk, pulling out a thick legal document. Hannah recognized the heavy binding, the formal script of a non-disclosure agreement. He had made her sign one, a formality she'd barely understood in her haze of fear. Now he looked at it, a flicker of cold contempt in his eyes, and then, with a sharp, tearing sound, he shredded it. The act was deliberate, almost violent, the paper tearing into long, jagged strips. "They've broken every pact, every agreement," he stated, his voice flat, emotionless. "They are no longer bound by anything. And neither am I." The symbolic act was a revelation. It confirmed the deadly reality of her situation. This wasn't just corporate espionage, it was an all-out war, and Zane, in his tailored suit, was prepared to fight it with every weapon at his disposal. He was revealing his true nature, a force of nature as unyielding as the concrete and steel of his tower. And she, by his side, was now inextricably bound to that power. She looked at the shredded paper, then at him, his profile stark and formidable against the city lights. Her fear was still a cold knot in her stomach, but it was overshadowed by a growing, profound understanding. His ruthlessness was not just a characteristic, it was her shield. In this dangerous new world, his dominance was the only thing standing between her and utter annihilation. To obey him, to trust him implicitly, was not just a choice, it was survival. And in that terrifying, absolute certainty, Hannah found a strange, undeniable refuge. The chilling reality of the orchid petal, the symbolic shredding of the non-disclosure agreement, had finally broken through Hannah's last vestiges of denial. The stakes were no longer theoretical, they were deadly, personal. The conspirators were not just a distant threat, they were a patient, venomous shadow reaching into her past, reminding her they knew exactly where she had been. Every word Zane had uttered, every cold command, now resonated with a desperate, life-saving truth. Her small, quiet acts of defiance, her lingering yearning for independence, withered under the weight of this terrifying realization. She now fully comprehended the lethal game they were in, and she knew, with an absolute clarity that settled deep in her bones, that her only chance of survival lay in absolute, unquestioning compliance to Zane's will. She no longer fought his rules. When he instructed her to stay within the penthouse, she did. When he spoke of security protocols, her attention was rapt, eager to understand how best to follow them. Her fear was still a constant companion, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was now overshadowed by a profound, almost desperate trust in Zane. She sought safety in his overwhelming control, finding a strange, quiet peace in letting him carry the immense burden of their protection. To obey was to be shielded, to submit to his decisions was to live. The penthouse, already a fortress, hardened further. Security, once subtle, became overtly visible. Guards, silent and imposing, now stood posted at every access point to their floor, their presence a constant, unblinking reminder of the external threat. Cameras, once discreetly tucked into corners, were now clearly evident, their red lights blinking, watching every inch of their opulent prison. Restricted zones, previously unmarked, were now explicitly pointed out, their boundaries absolute. Hannah was given a new security keycard, heavy and metallic, unique to her, granting her access to their private elevator and certain secure areas within the building. It felt like a symbol, not just of her protected status, but of her belonging, however strange, to Zane's world. She was no longer an outsider, but a piece of his domain, to be guarded fiercely. One afternoon, the quiet hum of the penthouse was suddenly pierced by a sharp, urgent voice from Zane's comms. Hannah was in the living room sketching, When his head of security reported, his voice tight, "Mr. Volkov, we have a confirmed heat signature on the adjacent building. Level 27, appears to be a high-powered scope." Hannah froze, her pencil dropping with a soft tap onto her sketchbook. A sniper aimed at them. Her breath caught in her throat. The windows, so vast and beautiful, suddenly seemed like gaping vulnerabilities. She felt a cold dread spread through her, paralyzing her. Zane moved instantly, his voice, calm but laced with a chilling authority, cut through the comms. "Contain it. Do not engage until absolute confirmation. Hannah, move to the inner sanctuary now." He didn't need to tell her twice. Her legs, stiff with fear, obeyed without hesitation. She scrambled towards the reinforced inner room he had designated, her heart hammering against her ribs. She heard the swift, decisive movements of his security team, the low, urgent whispers, but her focus was entirely on his command. She reached the door, pushing it open, and slipped inside, the heavy thud of it closing behind her echoing the finality of her submission. She huddled in the silent, windowless room, listening, trembling, but trusting. She heard Zane's voice, a steady, unwavering presence in the outer room, directing, commanding. There was no panic in him, only cold, lethal efficiency. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only minutes, the all-clear came. The threat had been neutralized, the conspirators thwarted once more, pushed back from the edge of their fortress. When she finally emerged, her knees still weak, Zane was standing by the panoramic window, his back to her, looking out at the city. The pale winter light caught the sharp lines of his profile, emphasizing his formidable presence. He didn't turn immediately, but she felt his awareness of her, a silent pull. Then he turned. His gaze was intense, assessing but devoid of anger. He didn't say anything, didn't need to. He simply walked over to a nearby chair, picked up his dark, tailored coat, and without a word, came to her. He didn't ask her to turn. He simply draped the heavy, warm fabric around her shoulders, the scent of him, crisp, clean, powerful, enveloping her. The gesture was simple, yet profoundly protective. His hand lingered for a moment, a brief, solid weight on her shoulder, before he withdrew. She clutched the coat, the soft wool a tangible comfort against her trembling body. In that moment, surrounded by his warmth, shielded by his power, Hannah felt an undeniable, almost addictive sense of refuge. She was utterly safe, cherished even, under his formidable protection. His dominance, once a terrifying force, was now the unwavering wall that stood between her and the dangerous world outside. She looked up at him, her gaze meeting his, and offered him her silent, absolute obedience. It was all she had, and it was everything. The air in the penthouse crackled with a new, sharper tension. Hannah felt it like a hum beneath her skin, a subtle shift in the carefully controlled atmosphere. Zane's presence, always formidable, had become even more intense, more consuming. He was constantly on calls, his deep voice a low, urgent murmur from his study, or cutting through the vast living space as he paced, issuing commands to unseen subordinates. She heard snippets, data breach attempts, market manipulation, hostile takeover bids. The conspirators, desperate after their failed attempts to reach her, were escalating their attacks, not just on her, but on the very foundations of Zane's empire. He was fighting battles on multiple fronts, a titan under siege, and Hannah, tucked away in his golden cage, felt the immense pressure radiating from him. She watched him, mesmerized by his unwavering focus, his tireless energy. Hours blurred into days, and he seemed to operate on sheer will, his tailored suits barely rumpled, his gaze sharp and unyielding. The lines around his mouth, already severe, seemed to deepen with exhaustion and relentless concentration. He carried the weight of everything, of everyone, and she, a small, quiet figure in the periphery, felt an overwhelming urge to somehow ease his burden. Hannah knew her place was not to question, not to interfere. Her obedience was her primary duty, her safety his. Yet, as the nights grew longer and the tension thickened, she found herself drawn to him, a silent, almost instinctive pull. One evening, well past midnight, she found him by the panoramic windows, his silhouette stark against the glittering city lights, a phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He looked utterly alone, despite the vastness of the penthouse and the invisible army he commanded. Hesitantly, she moved from the sofa, her steps soft on the thick carpet. She went to the kitchen, a space she was now intimately familiar with, and quietly brewed a pot of his preferred dark, bitter coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured it into a heavy ceramic mug, adding a splash of cream and a single sugar, just as she'd noticed he liked it. It was a small, domestic act, almost insignificant in the face of the colossal fight he was waging, but it was all she had to offer. She approached him slowly, the warmth of the mug a comfort in her hands. He didn't immediately acknowledge her, his focus still on the phone call, his expression unreadable. She waited, standing a respectful distance away, feeling impossibly small beside his towering frame, unsure if he would even notice her. When he finally ended the call, his thumb brushing a dismissive gesture across the screen, he turned. His dark eyes, usually so cold and assessing, swept over her, taking in the mug, her quiet presence. A flicker, almost imperceptible, softened the hard line of his jaw. He didn't smile, didn't offer a word of thanks, but he reached out, his large hand enveloping the mug. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, startling contact that sent a jolt through her. She felt the warmth of his skin, the sheer power contained within his touch, and her breath hitched. He took a slow sip, his gaze still fixed on her, as if assessing her. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the city. Hannah felt exposed, vulnerable, yet a strange warmth bloomed in her chest. She had offered a small comfort and he had accepted it. His dominance remained absolute, but in that moment she felt a subtle shift, a recognition of her presence that went beyond mere surveillance. Later, she would sometimes find him in the main living area, poring over complex documents, the glow of his tablet casting shadows on his face. She would simply sit on a nearby sofa, sketching quietly, her presence a soft anchor in the storm of his work. She never spoke unless spoken to, never intruded, simply existed, and he, though still entirely engrossed, would occasionally glance up, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. In those brief exchanges, she saw not just the ruthless CEO, but a man who, amidst the chaos, found a quiet, unspoken reliance on her unwavering calm. Her unquestioning trust, her silent acceptance of his authority, became a subtle source of strength for him. She was his wife, his protected, and in her quiet devotion, she was becoming an indispensable part of his formidable world. The air in the penthouse crackled with a new, sharper tension. Hannah felt it like a hum beneath her skin, a subtle shift in the carefully controlled atmosphere. Zane's presence, always formidable, had become even more intense, more consuming. He was constantly on calls, his deep voice a low, urgent murmur from his study, or cutting through the vast living space as he paced, issuing commands to unseen subordinates. She heard snippets, data breach attempts, market manipulation, hostile takeover bids. The conspirators, desperate after their failed attempts to reach her, were escalating their attacks not just on her, but on the very foundations of Zane's empire. He was fighting battles on multiple fronts, a titan under siege, and Hannah, tucked away in his golden cage, felt the immense pressure radiating from him. She watched him, mesmerized by his unwavering focus, his tireless energy. Hours blurred into days, and he seemed to operate on sheer will. His tailored suits barely rumpled, his gaze sharp and unyielding. The lines around his mouth, already severe, seemed to deepen with exhaustion and relentless concentration. He carried the weight of everything, of everyone, and she, a small, quiet figure in the periphery, felt an overwhelming urge to somehow ease his burden. Hannah knew her place was not to question, not to interfere. Her obedience was her primary duty, her safety his. Yet as the nights grew longer and the tension thickened, she found herself drawn to him, a silent, almost instinctive pull. One evening, well past midnight, she found him by the panoramic windows, his silhouette stark against the glittering city lights. A phone pressed to his ear, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He looked utterly alone, despite the vastness of the penthouse and the invisible army he commanded. Hesitantly, she moved from the sofa, her steps soft on the thick carpet. She went to the kitchen, a space she was now intimately familiar with, and quietly brewed a pot of his preferred dark, bitter coffee. Her hands trembled slightly as she poured it into a heavy ceramic mug, adding a splash of cream and a single sugar, just as she'd noticed he liked it. It was a small domestic act, almost insignificant in the face of the colossal fight he was waging, but it was all she had to offer. She approached him slowly, the warmth of the mug a comfort in her hands. He didn't immediately acknowledge her, his focus still on the phone call, his expression unreadable. She waited, standing a respectful distance away, feeling impossibly small beside his towering frame, unsure if he would even notice her. When he finally ended the call, his thumb brushing a dismissive gesture across the screen, he turned. His dark eyes, usually so cold and assessing, swept over her, taking in the mug, her quiet presence. A flicker, almost imperceptible, softened the hard line of his jaw. He didn't smile, didn't offer a word of thanks, but he reached out, his large hand enveloping the mug. His fingers brushed hers, a brief, startling contact that sent a jolt through her. She felt the warmth of his skin, the sheer power contained within his touch, and her breath hitched. He took a slow sip, his gaze still fixed on her, as if assessing her. The silence stretched, filled only by the distant hum of the city. Hannah felt exposed, vulnerable, yet a strange warmth bloomed in her chest. She had offered a small comfort, and he had accepted it. His dominance remained absolute, but in that moment she felt a subtle shift, a recognition of her presence that went beyond mere surveillance. Later, she would sometimes find him in the main living area, poring over complex documents, the glow of his tablet casting shadows on his face. She would simply sit on a nearby sofa, sketching quietly, her presence a soft anchor in the storm of his work. She never spoke unless spoken to, never intruded, simply existed. And he, though still entirely engrossed, would occasionally glance up, his eyes meeting hers for a fleeting moment. In those brief exchanges, she saw not just the ruthless CEO, but a man who, amidst the chaos, found a quiet, unspoken reliance on her unwavering calm. Her unquestioning trust, her silent acceptance of his authority, became a subtle source of strength for him. She was his wife, his protected, and in her quiet devotion, she was becoming an indispensable part of his formidable world. The quiet calm of the penthouse was shattered by the sharp, insistent chime of the security panel. Zane, who had been reviewing schematics on a holographic display, moved instantly, his body coiling with a predator's grace. Hannah, sketching on the adjacent sofa, froze, her pencil clattering to the polished floor. His gaze, sharp and cold, locked onto the screen. It displayed a package, small and unassuming, delivered to the highly secure drop-off point, addressed simply to Hannah Mercer. A cold dread seeped into Hannah's bones. No one was supposed to know she was here, let alone send her anything. Zane's security chief's voice, tight with urgency, came through the comms. "Sir, it's been cleared, but it's a personal item. Unusual." Zane's jaw tightened. "Send it up." His voice was a low, dangerous rumble. Moments later, a security officer, grim-faced, delivered a small, plain cardboard box. Zane took it, his large hands carefully opening it with a precision that belied the fury building in his eyes. Hannah watched, her breath caught in her throat, her entire body rigid with fear. Inside, nestled on a bed of shredded paper, was a single, faded photograph. It was a picture of Hannah and her mother, laughing years ago at their old apartment, a small, vibrant life, now a distant memory. But the photo had been altered. Hannah's face was circled in bright red ink, and across her mother's image, a crude, slashing X. Beneath it, scrawled in block letters, was a chilling message. "We know your weakness, and we know where you sleep." Hannah gasped, a raw, choked sound. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. Her weakness, her mother. The message was a brutal, intimate violation, a direct blow to the only part of her life she truly cherished. The conspirators had not just found her. They had found the very core of her vulnerability, and they were wielding it like a knife. Her eyes welled with tears, blurring Zane's formidable silhouette. Zane's entire body went rigid, his eyes, fixed on the defaced photograph, darkened to a depth that was almost black, a terrifying void. Hannah had never seen him like this. A low, guttural growl rumbled in his chest, a sound that was less human, more primal. He crushed the box and its contents in his fist, the cardboard crumpling under the sheer force of his rage. The air around him seemed to crackle with an almost palpable fury, a dangerous, potent energy that made the hairs on Hannah's arms stand on end. He turned to her, his gaze blazing with a cold, protective fire. His voice, when it came, was a low, terrifying snarl, vibrating with an intensity that seemed to shake the very foundations of the penthouse. They dare to threaten what is mine." His eyes swept over her, a possessive, almost predatory claim. "Do you understand, Hannah? They will learn. They will learn what happens when you touch what I protect." He took a step towards her, and Hannah instinctively flinched, not from fear of him, but from the raw, unleashed power he exuded. He towered over her, his immense presence utterly overwhelming, his rage a force of nature. "Your obedience, Hannah, will be absolute, your trust unwavering. You will not question me, you will not deviate. You will exist entirely within my protection, because I will annihilate anyone who dares to come for you, anyone who dares to even think of touching what is mine. Do you understand?" His voice was a command, a vow, a declaration of war. Hannah, though terrified by the sheer ferocity of his protective instincts, felt a strange, undeniable shift within her. She saw not just his power, but the terrifying depth of his commitment to her safety. He wasn't just protecting an asset, he was protecting her. The realization settled deep in her soul, solidifying her resolve. Her breath hitched, and she looked up at him, her eyes wide, filled with tears, but also with a newfound, fierce devotion. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her entire being, trembling but resolute, offered him her complete, unwavering trust. In that moment, surrounded by his towering fury, she understood that her safety, her very existence, was entirely bound to his formidable will. To be under his dominion was not just a necessity. It was an undeniable, terrifying, and utterly addictive refuge. She would give him everything he demanded, because in his absolute power, she would be safe. The air in the penthouse, already thick with unspoken tension, grew heavy, charged with a palpable sense of impending climax. Hannah felt it like an electric current beneath her skin, a premonition that settled deep in her bones. Zane moved through their opulent prison with a terrifying, coiled energy. He spent hours in his study, the sound of his deep voice a constant, commanding rumble as he directed his forces. Holographic displays flickered with complex schematics, maps of the city, and intricate network diagrams. He was a general preparing for the final battle, meticulously anticipating every move of an invisible enemy, and Hannah watched him, mesmerized by his formidable focus. He consolidated his resources, his commands crisp and absolute. She heard him issuing directives to his security teams, his lawyers, even to government contacts. He identified the primary instigators with cold precision, speaking their names with a chilling certainty that left no doubt of their fate. His power felt boundless, his control absolute. He was a force of nature gathering himself, and Hannah, small in his shadow, felt the immense, terrifying privilege of being swept into his orbit, protected by his overwhelming might. Outside the towering windows, the Chicago winter, usually a distant, glittering backdrop, began to transform. The sky, a bruised purple-gray, pressed down on the city. Flakes of snow, initially soft and sporadic, grew steadily heavier, swirling in frantic eddies around the skyscraper. The wind picked up, a mournful, rising howl that seemed to seep through the glass, mirroring the escalating tension within the penthouse. The city lights began to blur, swallowed by the thickening white curtain, until the world outside became a swirling vortex of ice and wind. The blizzard was building, isolating the Volkov Tower from the rest of the world, sealing their fate within its glass and steel walls. Hannah watched it, a strange sense of inevitability settling over her. The storm was not just a weather phenomenon. It was a physical manifestation of the storm Zane was about to unleash, and the storm that threatened to consume them all. The thought of being completely cut off, trapped with the danger, sent a fresh tremor of fear through her. But then she looked at Zane, his profile sharp and unyielding against the darkening sky, and the fear was tempered by the unwavering certainty of his protection. He would not let the storm, internal or external, touch her. Despite the terror that still clung to her, Hannah refused to be a burden. She would not allow her fear to paralyze her, to distract him. Retreating to her corner of the vast living room, she sought solace and strength in her art. Her worn sketchbook became her shield, her pencil a silent weapon against the rising anxiety. She drew furiously, her hand moving with an almost desperate energy, externalizing the swirling chaos within her. She sketched the howling blizzard outside, the stark lines of the penthouse, the grim faces of Zane's security team. And then, unknowingly, her pencil began to trace the familiar, powerful lines of Zane himself. She drew him by the window, a dark, imposing silhouette, his shoulders broad, his stance unwavering. She sketched his hands, large and capable, holding a phone, a tablet, commanding. She captured the intensity in his dark eyes, the severe set of his jaw, the sheer, unyielding power that radiated from him. She saw him not just as her captor or her protector, but as the immovable force against which all threats would break. In capturing his strength on paper, in immortalizing his powerful, protective stances, Hannah found a quiet, unexpected strength within herself. It was a form of silent devotion, a recognition that in his absolute dominance she had found her refuge, her anchor in the impending storm. The air in the penthouse had been heavy with anticipation, but now the world outside was a maelstrom. The blizzard hit with a ferocity Hannah had never witnessed. The towering windows, once a panoramic frame for the city, became a swirling canvas of white. Snow hammered against the glass with a relentless force, an icy, howling shriek that vibrated through the very structure of the building. The skyscraper groaned, a low, ominous sound that seemed to echo the desperate struggle unfolding within. Visibility dropped to zero. Chicago, the sprawling, glittering city, was completely swallowed, leaving them isolated, cut off, a tiny, fragile island in a raging sea of white. Hannah pressed her palm against the cold glass, feeling the immense, terrifying power of the storm. knowing with a cold certainty that this was it, the conspirators' last chance. And Zane knew it too. He stood by the corner office window, a dark, formidable silhouette against the furious whiteout. The shift in his demeanor was palpable. The relentless pressure of the past days had honed him to an even sharper edge, stripping away any last vestiges of calm. He turned, his gaze sweeping over her, intense and unyielding. The silence that fell between them, broken only by the blizzard's shriek, was heavy with unspoken words. "They will make their move tonight," Zane stated, his voice low, a dangerous rumble that cut through the storm's roar. "The isolation, the chaos, it's their opportunity, and their last." Hannah's breath hitched. She could only nod, her throat suddenly tight. Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through her, but she forced herself to meet his gaze, waiting for his command. He began to outline his plan, his voice devoid of emotion, each word a crisp, non-negotiable decree. "My security teams are in position, countermeasures are active, but they will breach. They will try to reach this floor. My objective is simple: eliminate them, all of them." His tone was chillingly precise, unburdened by mercy or hesitation. Hannah imagined the ruthlessness, the sheer brutal efficiency with which he would move, a predator in his own domain. It was terrifying to hear, to truly grasp the lethal intent behind his words, but a strange, unshakable calm began to settle over her. He was in control, absolutely. "Your role," he continued, his eyes locking onto hers, "is absolute obedience. You will follow my instructions without question, without delay. The moment I give the order, you will move to the reinforced inner sanctuary on this floor. It is secure, soundproofed, and completely hidden. You will not emerge until I come for you. Do you understand?" His gaze was unwavering, demanding not just acknowledgement, but complete, unequivocal compliance. Hannah felt the full weight of his authority, the absolute, undeniable power he held over her in this moment. She was small, vulnerable, her life held in the palm of his hand, and she instinctively knew that her safety depended entirely on her submission to his will. She wanted to ask, to question, to understand the specifics, but the words died on her tongue. The sheer force of his presence, the unwavering certainty in his dark eyes, silenced her. There was no room for argument, no space for hesitation. Her face was pale, her heart hammering against her ribs, but her eyes, wide and resolute, met his. She didn't fight him. She didn't question. Her silence was her answer, her direct gaze a promise. It was a silent vow, forged in the heart of the raging blizzard, a profound, terrifying acceptance of her place by his side. She would not be a burden. She would be his entirely. The snowy city lights, usually a shimmering spectacle, were now just faint, blurred glows beyond the furious whiteout, casting the corner office in an isolated, almost ethereal light. In that solitary space cut off from the entire world, Hannah looked at Zane. She was terrified, yes, but beneath that terror, a deep, unwavering trust bloomed. She was not just accepting his protection, she was choosing it, choosing him. Her silent acceptance, her absolute submission, was her way of standing by him, a promise that whatever horrors the storm brought, she would face them under his dominion, safe within his formidable shadow. The blizzard's roar had reached a deafening crescendo, shaking the very foundations of the Volkov Tower when it happened. One moment, the penthouse was a beacon of light against the furious whiteout. The next, it plunged into absolute, suffocating darkness. The emergency lights flickered on, casting long, eerie shadows, then died completely, leaving behind a silence so profound it felt like the world had stopped. The only sound was the howling wind, a mournful, hungry cry that seemed to echo the chill that seeped into Hannah's bones. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic, terrified beat. The power was out. They were truly isolated. Zane moved instantly, a dark, powerful silhouette against the faint, bruised light of the storm-ravaged sky beyond the windows. There was no hesitation in him, no trace of fear. He was a predator in the dark. His movements precise, utterly devoid of wasted motion. His voice, deep and resonant even in the sudden quiet, cut through the oppressive darkness. "Hannah, now, the sanctuary." His command was absolute, a lifeline in the terrifying blackness. Hannah didn't question, didn't hesitate. Her legs, trembling but obedient, propelled her towards the reinforced inner room he had designated. She felt his large hand on her back, guiding her, not gently, but with an unwavering force that left no room for doubt or deviation. He opened the heavy, soundproof door, ushering her inside. The small room was utterly black, a vacuum of light and sound. "Stay here. Do not make a sound. Do not open this door, no matter what you hear. Do you understand?" His voice was close, vibrating with a dangerous intensity that made her entire body shiver. She could feel his immense presence looming over her, a formidable wall of muscle and will. Hannah could only nod, mute with terror, desperate to convey her absolute compliance. She felt him brush past her, his scent, crisp, powerful, filling her senses for a fleeting moment before he was gone. The heavy door swung shut with a thick thud, sealing her in complete darkness, cutting her off from the world, from him. The silence was absolute, broken only by the frantic hammering of her own heart. She huddled on the floor, pressing her back against the cold, unyielding wall, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her mind reeled, imagining the horrors unfolding just beyond the impenetrable door. She was trapped, blind and deaf, in a hidden pocket of safety, utterly dependent on Zane. Her fear was a living, breathing thing, crawling over her skin, yet beneath it, a strange, profound trust in him bloomed. He had commanded her to be safe, and she believed with every fiber of her being that he would make it so. Then the first sound came, a distant, muffled thud, followed by another and another, sounds of struggle. They were on the executive floor. They had breached. Hannah pressed her hands over her mouth, biting back a whimper. Her breath hitched, ragged and shallow. She heard a shout, sharp and quickly cut off, followed by a sickening, bone-crunching impact that resonated through the floor. It was brutal, swift, and utterly terrifying. Her imagination, fueled by fear, painted gruesome pictures in the darkness. She pictured Zane, a dark force in his tailored suit, moving through the blacked-out corridors. She could almost see the cold, lethal efficiency with which he would strike, his formidable power unleashed, breaking bones and spilling blood to protect what was his. The sounds were muffled, distorted by the thick walls, but they were enough. Another grunt, heavier this time, then a series of rapid, forceful blows like a relentless hammer. Hannah trembled, her entire body shaking uncontrollably. Tears streamed down her face, hot and silent in the darkness. She was terrified, overwhelmed by the raw, primal violence she was witnessing, however indirectly. But even amidst the terror, a strange sense of awe, of absolute certainty settled over her. He was doing it. He was fighting for her safety, for her life. His dominance, his unwavering command was being brutally, definitively enforced. She had given him her obedience, her trust, and he was honoring it with a terrifying absolute force. In the chilling sounds of his fight, Hannah found her strange, unsettling refuge. She was safe, utterly safe, because Zane Volkov was out there, a force of raw, unyielding power, eliminating every threat that dared to come for his wife. And she, trembling in the darkness, implicitly trusted him to finish what he started. The last bone-crunching impact resonated through the floor, a sickening finality that made Hannah flinch, her body coiling tighter against the cold wall. Then an absolute, profound silence descended. The blizzard's howl was still a furious roar beyond the soundproofed walls, but the sounds of struggle, the muffled shouts, the terrifying, brutal symphony of Zane's fight, all of it had ceased. Hannah held her breath, straining her ears, waiting. For what, she didn't know. For the door to open. For another sound? The silence was heavier than any noise, thick with the weight of what had just transpired. She was trembling, tears still silently tracking paths down her face, but beneath the raw terror, a strange, unshakable certainty began to bloom. He had done it. He had won. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Her muscles ached, cramped from being held rigid for so long. Just when she thought the suffocating darkness might consume her, she heard a soft click. The heavy door to the sanctuary opened, letting in a sliver of the emergency lighting from the outer room, a bruised, pale glow that did little to dispel the shadows. Zane stood there, a towering, formidable silhouette in the doorway. He was disheveled, his expensive tailored suit rumpled, a dark stain visible on his pristine white shirt, but his posture was as unyielding as ever. His dark eyes, intense and unwavering, swept over the small hidden room, finding her huddled on the floor. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His presence alone was a command, a silent declaration of victory, a promise of safety. Hannah scrambled to her feet, her legs weak and unsteady. The sight of him, whole and formidable, washed over her like a tidal wave of relief, so potent it almost buckled her knees. She felt the lingering terror begin to recede, replaced by an overwhelming sense of gratitude, of absolute trust. She didn't look beyond him, didn't dare to glimpse the aftermath of his battle. All that mattered was that he was there, standing between her and the horror. He simply extended his hand, a silent, powerful gesture. Hannah didn't hesitate. She placed her trembling hand in his, and his large fingers closed around hers, a firm, reassuring grip that grounded her. He pulled her gently from the room, and she instinctively moved to his side, seeking the warmth and solidity of his presence. He didn't release her hand, keeping her close as he led her through the dimly lit, now silent, executive floor. The air was cold, faintly metallic, but the overwhelming sense of menace had vanished, replaced by an eerie stillness. As they reached the corner office, the roar of the blizzard outside seemed to lessen, fading to a distant moan. And then, cutting through the remaining howls of the wind, came a new sound, the rhythmic, pulsing thrum of helicopter blades. Zane paused by the floor-to-ceiling windows, his gaze sweeping the snow-dusted city lights that were slowly beginning to re-emerge from the whiteout. The sound grew louder, closer, until the distinctive shape of an emergency rescue helicopter materialized out of the swirling snow, its landing lights cutting through the gloom as it settled onto the rooftop helipad. He turned to her, his expression unreadable in the dim light. "That is your exit, Hannah." His voice was low, devoid of any command, yet heavy with unspoken meaning. "A chance for you to leave this behind, to walk away from all of it, from the danger, from me. You can take it now." Hannah stared at him, bewildered by the unexpected offer. Leave? The thought, once a desperate yearning, now felt alien, almost wrong. She pictured herself stepping onto that helicopter, flying away, back to a life of quiet anonymity, of mundane struggles. But something had fundamentally shifted within her. The world outside, the world of her past, now seemed cold, unprotected, terrifyingly vulnerable. Here, by his side, she had faced death and emerged, not unscathed, but undeniably safe. The freedom he offered felt like a return to a dangerous fragility, a deliberate choice to leave the impenetrable fortress he had built around her. Her gaze drifted to her left hand, where Zane's ring, a simple, elegant band of white gold, had rested since the day he had claimed her. It had been a symbol of a forced marriage, a necessary charade, but now, in the aftermath of the storm, after witnessing the terrifying depths of his protection, it felt different. It felt like a promise. She looked up at him, her eyes still wet with unshed tears, filled with a new, fierce resolve. She didn't need to speak, she didn't need to explain. She simply lifted her left hand, her fingers trembling slightly and pressed the cool metal of the ring firmly against her skin, a conscious, deliberate act of acceptance. It was a silent vow, a physical declaration that she was choosing this, choosing him, choosing his dominion, not out of fear, but out of a profound, undeniable trust. She was not running, she was staying. Zane watched her, his dark eyes searching hers. And a flicker, a subtle, almost imperceptible softening, touched the hard planes of his face. The marriage of convenience, forged in fear and necessity, had just been reforged in fire. She would stand by him, not just through the fight, but for always. The silence that followed Hannah's silent vow, broken only by the helicopter's receding thrum, was profound. Zane's hand, still clasped firmly around hers, was the only solid thing in a world that felt suddenly too quiet, too still. Then the first distant wail of sirens pierced the quieted blizzard, growing steadily louder, closer. Emergency lights, a kaleidoscope of red and blue, began to flash against the snow-whipped glass of the tower, painting the pristine corporate offices in a macabre, pulsing glow. Police, forensics, media. Hannah felt a fresh wave of panic, a visceral recoil from the impending chaos, from the questions, the scrutiny. She instinctively pressed closer to Zane, seeking the formidable shelter of his body. He didn't speak, but his grip tightened, a silent reassurance that was also a clear statement of possession. He moved, pulling her gently but firmly behind him, positioning her so his broad back shielded her from the doorway as his security team, grim-faced and efficient, began to manage the influx of uniformed officers. Zane, despite the lingering signs of the brutal fight, a dark smear on his shirt, a subtle stiffness in his movements, was utterly in command. He spoke in low, clipped tones, giving orders, answering questions with a cold, precise authority that brooked no argument. He was a force, an unyielding wall against the world, and Hannah felt herself shrinking into his shadow, safe from the glaring lights and probing questions, protected by his overwhelming presence. As the cleanup began, a methodical, grim process unfolding beyond her direct sight, Hannah remained tethered to Zane. He never let go of her hand, never allowed her to stray more than a foot from his side. She watched him, mesmerized by his cold, efficient control over the aftermath, over the very narratives that would emerge. He was protecting her, not just from physical harm, but from any further intrusion, any lingering shadow of the horror they had just endured. Her mind, still reeling from the raw violence she had only glimpsed, began to process the profound shift in their relationship. The marriage, once a terrifying convenience, was now something else entirely. She had chosen him, chosen his dominance, and in that choice she had found not just survival, but an unexpected peace. Later, in the quiet sanctuary of the penthouse, with the police finally gone and the tower returned to its eerie calm, Hannah sank onto a sofa, her body still trembling with residual adrenaline. The trauma of the blackout, the sounds of the fight, the chilling reality of the threat, it all pressed down on her. She felt emotionally raw, utterly vulnerable, her strength drained. Zane, after giving a final, curt instruction into his comms, came to stand before her. He looked down at her, his dark eyes intense, assessing. She expected a command, a directive for rest, but instead he simply reached out. His large hand, usually so commanding, settled lightly on her cheek. His thumb brushed over the faint tear tracks, a surprisingly gentle, almost tender gesture that made her breath catch. He didn't speak, but the weight of his gaze, the quiet concern in his dark eyes, communicated more than words ever could. It was a rare glimpse into a softer side of his formidable nature, a silent acknowledgement of her fragility in this moment. He was still the dominant, unyielding man who had just broken bones to protect her, but now His dominance was infused with a fierce, possessive tenderness. He withdrew his hand, but the connection lingered. "You will rest," he stated, his voice low. A command that was undeniably absolute, yet laced with a subtle undercurrent of care. "You will eat, and you will not leave my sight." He turned, walking towards his study, but paused at the doorway, his gaze sweeping back to her. "You are safe, Hannah. Completely." And in that moment, as she watched him, strong and unyielding, Hannah knew it was true. Their marriage, once forced, was now real, desired, a bond forged in fire and fear and sealed by a trust so profound it was almost addictive. She was cherished, utterly safe, and irrevocably his. Months later, the biting Chicago wind still swept through the city, but Hannah Mercer no longer felt its sting as she once had. She was no longer Hannah Mercer, the invisible cleaning lady. She was Hannah Volkov, wife to Zane Volkov, and her name, once synonymous with quiet struggle, now carried an undeniable weight of power and protection. Her mother, thriving in a sunnier climate, sent cheerful updates, free of the burdens that had once defined Hannah's life. The old fears, the constant gnawing anxiety had receded, replaced by a deep, abiding sense of security that had become as essential as the air she breathed. The penthouse, once a magnificent cage, was now simply home. Her days were no longer a desperate scramble for survival, but a quiet rhythm of artistic creation. Her worn sketchbook, once a secret rebellion, was now a celebrated voice. She had signed her first graphic novel contract, the ink still fresh on the pages, and for the first time she had signed it not as Mercer, but proudly, definitively, as Hannah Volkov. The publishing world, initially intrigued by the quiet young artist, was captivated by her vivid storytelling, her intricate character designs. Her villains, sharp-suited and cold-eyed, bore a striking resemblance to the corporate traitors who had once haunted her nights. It was her artistic revenge, her quiet assertion of her new identity, her strength forged in the crucible of Zane's world. Zane Volkov remained a formidable titan. In boardrooms across the globe, his name was still whispered with a mix of fear and respect. His ruthlessness was unmatched, his power absolute, his decisions shaping industries and crushing competitors with the same cold efficiency he had used to eliminate the conspirators. He was a force of nature, unyielding, demanding, his empire expanding with relentless precision. The vastness of his responsibilities, the ceaseless demands on his time, were immense, yet Hannah never felt neglected, never felt anything less than his primary focus. For despite his demanding schedule, despite the global influence he wielded, Zane upheld a ritual, a silent, powerful affirmation of their bond that had become the bedrock of Hannah's world. Every single night, without fail, he would personally walk her to their private elevator. It didn't matter if he had just closed a multi-billion-dollar deal, if he was exhausted from a transatlantic flight, or if the city was locked in the grip of another blizzard. He would come for her. He would find her in the vast living room, perhaps curled on a sofa with a book or by the window, sketching, lost in her own creative world. His presence would simply fill the space, a silent, powerful command that drew her gaze. He wouldn't need to speak. Hannah would rise, her hand instinctively reaching for his. His large, warm fingers would close around hers, a firm, possessive grip that sent a familiar ripple of comfort through her. He would lead her across the polished marble, his broad shoulder a solid wall beside her, her smaller frame enveloped by his undeniable presence. His eyes, dark and intense, would sweep over her, a silent question, a silent demand for her trust, her compliance, and Hannah, looking up at him, would offer it freely, completely. She would step into the elevator, her hand still held firmly in his, and he would follow, filling the confined space with his formidable height, his dominant presence. The doors would close, sealing them in, a private moment in their shared sanctuary. It was more than just a walk. It was a daily reaffirmation of his unwavering protection, her cherished place by his side, an unbreakable, eternal bond forged in the fires of fear and solidified by an unshakable trust. She was safe, utterly cherished, and happily, completely under his enduring protection. And in his shadow, Hannah Volkov had finally found her truest strength. If you enjoyed this story, tell us where you're watching from and subscribe to Tales of Power and Desire to keep up with our intense romance.